So let's describe the different forms of foreign aid, evaluate the reasons why we want to give foreign aid, and also talk a little bit about the effects and consequences of aid. So there are four really forms of international aid. Aid itself is just assistance given to other countries on favorable terms. And tied aid is aid with conditions attached. And I'll give examples as soon as we're finished the definitions. Untied aid is aid without conditions attached. Bilateral aid is aid given by one country to another country, whereas multilateral aid is aid given by international organizations to a country or countries. And so we can have, for example, bilateral untied aid. That could be a thing. And so types of aid could include goods and services, it could include financial assistance, military aid, food aid, expertise, right? Like flying in experts from your country to consult on an issue in another country. It could also be emergency supplies in natural disasters or humanitarian crisis. And an example of tied aid would be US food aid money has to be used on food purchased and packaged in the US and shipped on US carriers. So the USA will give money to developing countries for food, but they have to use that money on US food shipped on US carriers. An example of multilateral aid would be something like the Global Fund, which is an organization that fights diseases. And if they provide financing to developing country to fight AIDS, that would be an example of multilateral aid. Bilateral aid would be an example of the US sending firefighters to Canada to help with forest fires. So there are 5 reasons for giving aid. First reason is they want to directly support infant industries or the export industry. So, for example, the US food aid supports the US food export industry. And so the US is literally handing out money to developing countries to grow their own export industry. Maybe we also want to incentivize future demand for our exports by helping another country develop economically. So for example, Japan gave untied aid in the form of concessional loans. And what concessional loans are, just loans given at a lower interest rate in 2018 to fund infrastructure projects in low development countries. What they found in that study was that a lot of the time those developing countries used Japanese money, the loans that were given to them at a concession basically, to buy Japanese goods and products. Like reciprocation is a thing. Number 3, for political influence when bargaining between different countries. So an example would be military aid by the US to Egypt to help support regional conflicts or mediate regional conflicts, so on and so forth. And that would give the US bargaining power over what happens in that region. Number 4, we want to influence economic policies of recipient countries. And so, for example, the International Monetary Fund, which is an financial organization of which there are like 190 member countries, they provide loans on the condition usually of privatization, austerity, and deregulation. Whatever they think would be beneficial for the financial future of the country. And so if the country does not follow IMF guidelines or rules, then they don't provide the loan. And then number 5, just for humanitarian global prosperity purposes. An example of this would be the UK giving ongoing aid to Yemen to help resolve the humanitarian crises over there. So just out of the goodness of our own heart. So aid may actually conflict with domestic policies on transfer payments especially, and other macroeconomic objectives because of the opportunity cost of aid. So aid, at the end of the day, is another type of resource that you're giving away. And so while that might provide benefits in another country, there's the cost of giving that away, right? Like, what if that money could have been used domestically? So there are three effects, and we're also going to talk a little bit about the importance of aid. Now, you see the cycle over here. If we're able to provide foreign aid in the form of investment, then productivity will go up, incomes will go up as a result, and there will be an increase in savings. So this is a cycle. This is a virtuous cycle. So aid can combat the lack of savings. If you remember from a previous video, we talked a little bit about poverty cycles and how that can come as a result of a lack of savings. But if we provide aid, we can actually start a virtuous cycle. But policy suggestions may be ineffective to the context of low-income countries. For example, the IMF might try to calm down inflation in a country by telling the country's government to cut spending on education, right? And that will also help you solve the budget deficit, for example, because the IMF obviously does not want countries to keep having to borrow money from other countries and organizations. But the result of cutting spending on education might have long-term negative effects. And so every policy has positives and negatives. Second thing, the financial aid in the form of low interest loans. So for example, Japan giving concessional loans to developing countries, China giving loans to fund infrastructure projects in the Middle East. All of that may increase the recipient country's debt burden. And so one day they might have to pay so much interest back to the country lending the money that they no longer have funds to put into their own economy. And with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about financial aid and external debt. Countries that receive aid can end up owing money to foreign banks, governments, and international organizations in the form of external debt. And this comes in two forms. One, loans which have not been repaid, and two, interest payments on those loans which have not been repaid. Both these payments are non-productive ways of spending money if we're defining productive ways of spending money as things that increase the long-term productivity and welfare of our own country. But nevertheless, there are 4 reasons why countries still get into debt. Number 1, there might be a persistent current account deficit, and as a result, financial account surplus. So for example, USA assets attract foreign investors to fund the current account deficit. Now, the USA is a unique situation because people like to hold money in the US dollar because it's the world reserve currency. That's a currency that has value and utility. Nevertheless, though, because the US likes to run a current account deficit, it's much more of an importer than an exporter. It's got a financial account surplus. And so it borrows money from different countries. Second reason, we might be overconfident, right? We might have overborrowing because we're overconfident in our ability to repay that loan in the future, usually coming with a confidence that our economy will continue to grow at its current rate. So that's what happened in 2009 with the Greece debt crisis. That came as a result of Greece overborrowing in the early 2000s. Number 3, the mismanaging of borrowed money leading to lower return than borrowing rates. So for example, Zambian investments in agriculture and infrastructure in the early 2000s just did not generate a good return. They spent the money that they borrowed, but it just wasn't worth the interest rate, which is the cost of getting into that debt. Then number 4, there might be unexpected events like supply and demand side shocks, as well as currency value changes. So for example, there was a lot of speculation during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which collapsed the Thai currency, the baht. And this caused it to default on quite a bit of dollar-denominated debt, which was not a good situation at that time. So similarly, there could be unexpected events like COVID-19 and the coronavirus, which probably threw a wrench in a lot of government's planning. So as a result of getting into debt, there are a few consequences. So we looked at why we get into debt. Let's look at the consequences of getting into debt. Well, we might be diverting funds towards interest payments, right? Away from improving the productive potential of an economy and the welfare of its people. Again, we said that if we're paying interest, we're not actually improving the productive capacity of our economy and our people's welfare. Number two, it might be difficult to enact policy that attracts foreign direct investment for future projects. So think about it this way. If you're running a company and your company owes a lot of money to other banks or other people, your company is not gonna be the best company to invest in, right? Like, not a lot of people will think, oh yeah, that's a riskless company. Same thing for countries. If countries have a lot of debts, that introduces a level of uncertainty about the future economics of that country. And so investors and multinational corporations are more hesitant to invest in countries with a lot of debt. There also might be decreases in credit ratings, and that would increase the interest rate that other countries or international organizations will charge in the future if the said country chooses to borrow more money. And so that's an example where, hey, if you run a business that borrows money and fails to pay it back, your credit rating gets decreased. And in the future, if you want to borrow money again, they charge you a higher interest rate. Number four, there's a reduced ability to borrow more in the future, and you might just default on your existing loans, which is not good at all. Because if you need more money for actually productive projects in the future, nobody would be willing to lend you that money.